Let's talk today about watercolor pencils, and actually there is a question that I repeatedly get asked on both YouTube and on my Patreon. Can you put colored pencils over the top of watercolor pencils? Now, whenever I create a drawing with watercolor pencils, I always follow the same steps. That is to build up the lightest colors and then activate it with the water. Wait for it to dry, then fill in the midtones, again activate with the water, then fill in the darkest colors, activate with the water one final time. And that gives me a kind of rough underpainting that I can build up over and fill in all of the final details. Now, when I'm working with watercolor pencils, I add those details in at the end with watercolor pencils. But can you use colored pencils instead? Now, I thought it would be fun today to treat this as a little experiment. Now, I have Faber-Castell watercolor pencils. Let's try putting Faber-Castell color pencils, so polychromos, over the top and just see how it works, if you get different results, and if the colored pencils behave in the same way as the watercolor pencils. So to test this out, I want to find a reference photo that has a good amount of detail in it, but also has a good amount of smooth areas as well. I really want to test the colored pencils, put them through their paces, and that'll be much easier to see with a quite complicated drawing. So I've selected this reference photo here. I've got some apples on a branch. The apples are really nice and smooth, and it'll be good to see if I can get the watercolor pencils with the colored pencils on top to look that smooth. But there's so much detail with all of the leaves. So the best thing to do is to get started with the drawing, and then we can have a look at the finished piece together at the end. Now, if you want to go through this apple drawing in a lot more detail with me, it is available on my Patreon. My Patreon includes loads of tutorials in a variety of different materials. I have watercolor pencils, colored pencils, and graphite pencils covering a variety of different subject matters. For every tutorial, I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colors I'll be using, sketch outlines, and the reference photo. And I have a good mix of some pretty fast drawings, as well as some much longer, more complicated drawings, but they tend to have a bit more wow factor. Check out the link in the description. So let's get started with this drawing, and I want to approach it in the same way that I would with any watercolor pencil drawing. I want to start off by building up the lightest colors. So I build up the lightest color I can see in each area. So first off, I'm looking at the apples themselves, and actually the lightest color I can see on the apples is a light pink, particularly where the light is hitting the red apples. So I'm going to go over and block in all of the apples with this kind of earthy pink color. Now, the number one thing I want to be doing here, as I do usually with watercolor pencil drawings, is to be pressing really nice and lightly. I want to build up a decent amount of the pencil, but I don't want that color to be built up in a really hard way. So I'm pressing really nice and lightly, and I'm also trying to get down the pencil as smoothly as possible. Although we will be activating this with the water, if I can get the pencil down nice and smooth, it's just going to blend much easier. So you can see I'm working here in sort of circular or oval motions to try and get that pencil down nice and smooth, rather than just scribbling back and forth. So once I've filled in all of the apples, I've put this pink on the whole apple rather than just where that pink spot is. We're trying to build up the color gradually here and build up a lot of layers of color, and it'll end up looking a lot richer. What I now want to do is look for the second lightest color on the apples. So actually that's a kind of purpley pink color, and I want to put this color anywhere that isn't just that really light pink. Once again, building up the pencil in as light and smooth way as possible. And what I always find interesting about watercolor pencils is how light the colors look before they're activated with water. They look like such pale pink colors at the moment, but they're going to get much brighter when activated, so do always bear that in mind. So now I've got something down on all of the apples. Let's take a minute to focus on the leaves, and I'm just going to block in a solid light green over any of the leaf areas, and all of the darker patches, obviously all of the details will be added in later. Now the final thing that I'm going to want to do from here is just put something down where there's a couple of stems. So just build up a very tiny bit of the brown. Although this brown is a pretty dark colour, it is the lightest colour in this area, and that's what I'm trying to fill in to start with. So once I'm happy with these lightest colours, I want to activate everything with the water. This is again exactly the same way as I would usually go about this, generally activating from the lighter colours towards the darker colours, or I end up just making a really muddy blend. But what a huge difference it makes on the colour. It's so much brighter. Let's do the same for all of the greenery along the background, and then once this has completely dried, I can move on to the mid-tone. So starting off by filling in a much richer, more vibrant red to anywhere that doesn't need to be those really lightest areas. So to begin with the watercolor pencils, for every area that I add in, I have to put less of the pencil down because I'm only doing that color or darker. And then I can also fill in on the apples this kind of reddish brown. I still think it's a mid-tone. It's not a really dark color, even though it is a brown. As we move on to the darker colors, we'll be using much darker browns and maybe even some black. And let's also use a darker green to fill in the main mid-tone or darker patches in the greenery. I don't need to get this absolutely perfect, but it is a really good opportunity for me to start mapping out, again, the key shapes. The most important thing with the watercolor pencils is to not only get some sort of color down on the paper, but also start mapping in where things are going to go. It's going to make my life so much easier when adding the watercolor pencils. And I would say adding in the greenery is the most time consuming section here. Let's just add a little bit of a slightly darker brown, not a dark brown, to some of the really shadowed areas on the apples and also on a few of the darker areas of the leaves. And then let's once again activate this with the water. And what a huge difference again is making to the color. Now I don't want to be blending this into the light areas, or as I say, it will make it all very, very muddy. I just want to get what I've got here looking nice and rich. So I'm working around from the left towards the right in quite a kind of methodical way. And I really think I'm starting to get a good background, a good basis of color. Now for the last few colors with the watercolor pencils, I can now move on to adding in the darkest colors. So this is the darkest brown that I've got in my set. This is the walnut brown. And I just want to put it on those absolute darkest areas of the apples. You'll see that the apples are looking a little bit kind of patchy, but that's okay. That's what we're hoping to fix with the colored pencils. And I'll also add this walnut brown over any darker areas of the leaves. So that's all I want to do for the darkest areas. I will add a black in, but a little bit later. I think it would be too harsh if I did it with the watercolor pencils. So this is where I'm leaving it with the watercolor pencils to build the color pencils over the top. As I say, I think the apples are looking very, very scratchy, but it's exactly how I would usually start with adding the details with the watercolor pencils. So let's have a look at the process of adding the polychromos over the top. And I kind of find it easiest to start by just focusing on the apples before then building up the leaves and then looking at the drawing as a whole. Now, the number one thing that I noticed whilst building up the polychromos is the paper. Now, whenever I work with watercolor pencils, I work on watercolor paper. It wouldn't work activating the watercolor pencils on the kind of paper that I use for colored pencils, so Bristol board. It wouldn't work. So I am using these pencils on a paper that is a bit grainier than I usually would. That's not necessarily a problem, but I think it is making them behave in maybe a slightly different way. I am using the hot pressed watercolor paper here, so it is the smoother version, but I still think it is rougher than what I'm used to. I think also because paper makes such a massive difference to how colored pencils behave, because this is a rougher paper, it's meaning that I'm needing to build up more layers, both more layers than I usually would, but I also think I'm needing to build up more layers than I would with the watercolor pencils, which is fine. It's just something that I think I should bear in mind, that it's going to be a longer process. Now, I would say with the polychromos, it is much easier to add in all of these details. Because polychromos are coloured pencils, they have a much firmer lead than the watercolour pencils. So when I sharpen these pencils, they keep a point for longer, they take longer to wear down, and it's just easier to get them to a nice sharp point. I always find watercolour pencils are a little bit, I want to say, crumbly. So it's definitely more than possible to be adding details in with watercolour pencils, but I do think it's easier with the coloured pencils just because of that more rigid, I guess, lead. So now the drawing's finished, I think it would be helpful to compare this drawing to maybe a different watercolour pencil drawing. And something that I feel I can see but is not really picking up very well on camera is the apple drawing with the coloured pencils just looks a little bit shinier, particularly on areas where I've built up more of the colour. I think because I need to build up more colour because of the pencils reacting differently with the paper, it just looks a little bit shiny. It's not a problem, but it's just something I've noted is different. I feel like the apples look a little bit grainy, but again, I think I'm comparing that to how a coloured pencil drawing would look. If I compare it to a watercolour pencil drawing, I actually think they look pretty similar. So can you add coloured pencils over the top of watercolour pencils to add in all of those final details? I would say you can. I don't know that I necessarily have a preference between adding watercolour pencils for the detail and coloured pencils. I think generally speaking, they make pretty similar finished drawings, but maybe the watercolour pencils are a bit faster. Now, I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to go through the drawing in a lot more detail, it is available on my Patreon. Now, in this video, I briefly covered layering and how I build up all of the different layers of watercolour pencils. If you want to go through that process in a lot more detail, check out this video here. I always find it fascinating how watercolour pencils build up. So, happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.